Hi, everyone. Hello, and welcome to State of Corporate Climate Action, translating up to the UNGC and Climate Week in New York City. My name is Corinne Hansen. I'm the VP of Sustainability at Green Places. We are, of course, carbon accounting software and decarbonization software. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to join here. I'm joined by Jake Raskoff from Ceres, and very excited to have you all on today to talk through some of the trends that we're seeing. Just want to give everyone a few minutes. I know nothing starts on time these days, and everyone's, I'm sure, coming from three other things. So probably at about 12:03 Eastern Time, 9:03 is Pacific. We'll go ahead and get started. I do want to just direct folks who are on to the Q&A. If you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, if you're familiar with Zoom, there's a Q&A box there. I mean, a chat box that I want you to click on, not Q&A. You can use the chat box here to send messages either directly to the panelists or to everyone. Please feel free to drop questions, concerns, things that you'd like us to answer at the end during our Q&A into the section here. Send them to everyone. Be helpful for folks to see what other questions land. And then, of course, we will leave time at the end for the Q&A. We've got quite a large number of slides we want to get through today. I think there's always more that we want to cover than we can feasibly get to. That's okay. So one thing I will say is that we are going to send these slides out for everyone to use as reference point. There should be more information on these slides than we're able to get to in just this conversation. But I want to try to leave a good chunk of time at the end here. Do feel free to also, while folks are getting started here in the webinar chat, go ahead and just let us know your name, your organization, where you're dialing in from. I think it's helpful for folks to see where everyone is dialing in and maybe who's heading to Climate Week. We're just at 12:02 here, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with introductions here. And Joyce, I think it does look like you may actually have to be the one clicking through the slides. Am I now moving these? Yeah, okay. Why don't you just take us to the welcome slide, and I'll have you try to tick through for us. Thanks. Okay, so as I said, hello and welcome everybody. My name is Corinne Hansen. I'm the VP of Sustainability here at Green Places. I oversee our carbon accounting team and all of our decarbonization work, and I've been working in the sustainability field for about 15 years. First on the Hill for both Senator Sanders and Senator Schumer, and then for NRDC, where I worked in environmental policy work. Most recently, I was running sustainability for SH Hotels and Resorts after a long tenure working in sustainability consulting for everyone from Nike to Starbucks, Facebook, AMD. What we try to do at Green Places is serve more the democratization of access to sustainability. We know that Fortune 500s can get involved in the space. The idea is how do we make it easier to access reporting requirements, sustainability programs, and hit goals and targets for the rest of the field that needs to be participating and working toward decarbonization. I'm joined by Jake Raskoff from Ceres, where he serves as the Director for Climate Disclosure and Securities Regulation. Jake, I'll go ahead and let you give a couple of points about yourself to introduce to everyone, and then I'll walk us through the agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Corinne. Nice to see everyone here. As Corinne mentioned, I work at Ceres on the Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets, which is our regulatory team at Ceres. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the organization, we are a nonprofit sustainability organization. We have an investor network that includes roughly 200 asset managers and asset owners with whom we work on a range of sustainability issues. And actually, the way that the investor network at Ceres got its start was convening a group of asset owners to petition the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission for better disclosure of climate risks, and that was more than 20 years ago. We also have a company network and a policy network, which is composed of name brand Fortune 500 type companies that, again, we work with in depth on a range of climate and sustainability risk management issues. And I lead our disclosure and securities regulation work. So at the U.S. federal level, work with agencies like the SEC and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. We've also been very active as an original co-sponsor of the legislation that became California's climate disclosure laws. and increasingly working internationally because our member companies and investors are more and more interested in regulations beyond the US that implicate a lot of US companies. So thank you for having me, Corinne.
It's a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much. One of the reasons that I'm excited to have you and Ceres as part of this conversation today is, of course, that I think Climate Week is supposed to be a focus on where corporate ambition and the public sector meet and align. And so, very happy to be speaking with you today. I think that's certainly been a mission of Ceres for a long time, and having you as an expert in the space, also bringing the corporate experience here as well. So, I'm just going to walk us through the agenda really briefly. We're going to talk a little bit about a couple of different points that we're seeing, trends in the space. Global momentum around sustainability broadly. There's a lot of discussion in the US landscape around momentum slowing. I think what we're seeing is that trends don't necessarily suggest that. The data doesn't necessarily suggest that. So we'll dive into that in the US landscape and sort of state level baseline. We'll talk about financing and capital market shifts, and we'll talk about what this really means for corporate actors, where we're seeing that momentum grow. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of looking ahead and what companies can do. So I just want to flag at the top of the call here in terms of what pressures and progress we're seeing in the space. What we're seeing is really rising complexity and compliance pressure. Basically, companies are being asked to respond to increasing regulations and requests for disclosure in an increasingly complex landscape. And so we want to try to talk a little bit about that context and ideally make it simpler to understand so you know what you're responding to. I also want to speak a little bit about Scope 3 and supply chain uncertainty. It's certainly been a persistent challenge, but I think it doesn't reach the headlines as commonly. But back to the headlines, AI. AI is a double-edged sword for climate action, certainly a major concern in the space. But then on the side of progress, rising ambition and credibility from companies, and also transition plans that are moving more into practice. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jake to dive us into the regulatory landscape and talk a little bit more about that rising complexity.
Sure. So I think in recent years, we've seen a very steady trend towards mandatory climate disclosure regulation, which we'll see on the next slide here. The intent here was to sort of elevate climate-related financial risks to the same footing as all other financial risks, because really climate-driven risks, whether physical or transition-related risks, do pose a lot of the same material risks to companies' operational and financial well-being that any other category of risk would, counterparty risk, credit risk. So there was just widespread call from investors to treat this information the same way we would any other source of risk. I think that there's obviously been a steady upward trend in voluntary sustainability and climate-related reporting from companies over the past few years. What investors were saying was that this sort of information, when it lived strictly in the voluntary sort of corporate social responsibility world, did not meet the same standard of consistency, comparability, and decision usefulness that the sort of disclosures that live in companies, annual statements and registration statements with securities regulators did. So the intent was to sort of create that standardized, consistent, comparable means of companies disclosing their climate risk exposure and their climate risk management strategies, and then let that information live in the same sorts of documents that all other financial information does, namely, those that public companies file with securities regulators, and then in some jurisdictions, submit the reports to national regulators and jurisdictions beyond just publishing on a company's website as its annual sustainability report. So you kind of see the trend towards consistency here. I think part of the problem was we had sort of, it's often called the alphabet soup of climate and sustainability related disclosure standards. There was really no, one language that companies were speaking, which obviously made the consumption of the information more difficult for investors and other stakeholders with an interest in these disclosures. The TCFD was kind of a watershed moment where we sort of introduced this framework, the pillars of what makes good climate disclosure, namely governance, strategy, risk management, and then metrics and targets. And then obviously within that lies information such as scope 1 through 3 greenhouse gas emissions, which obviously Corinne and the Green Places team is very familiar with and better placed to advise companies on. The TCFD recommendations were, I would say, sort of principles based. They did inform a lot of the reporting that companies were doing, and they have, widespread uptake. But the TCFD actually sort of ceased its operations and was subsumed by the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is a component of the IFRS Foundation, which any corporate preparer knows is the body that issues the IASB, which is the accounting standards that are widely used by companies outside the United States. In the US, we have GAAP accounting standards. The rest of the world uses the IFRS standards. So the IFRS Foundation now promulgated the ISSB standards, which basically took the entire TCFD framework, all of these pillars of disclosure, and turned it into more of a regulatory document. So we have the S1 and S2 standards, which are the general sustainability disclosure standards, and then the climate disclosure standards, respectively. And so these are now the intent of the ISSB is not just to inform voluntary disclosure, but to actually be adopted by national jurisdictions around the world, by securities regulators and legislatures around the world, so that this can be now the common language of climate disclosure. And the ISSB is also sort of looking into other areas of sustainability where they can create the same sort of mandatory disclosure frameworks. So alongside the ISSB, which is really intended to be, as I said, the global baseline for climate disclosure, we had the CSRD in Europe, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is really the most far-reaching mandatory disclosure regime in the world. It is extraterritorial in nature, which means that there are plenty of non-EU companies that will be subject to the CSRD. Unlike the EU's predecessor regulation, the CSRD is not dependent solely on a listing on an EU regulated exchange. It does implicate companies that just do a minimum threshold of business within the EU. And then, as we'll discuss in more depth, the EU is currently undertaking an omnibus simplification process that will impact both the CSRD, the disclosure standard, as well as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and other sustainability related regulations and directives in Europe. I think there's been a recognition among policymakers in Europe that trends globally are more towards simplification, and there's been like sort of a broader backlash against mandatory climate disclosure that we can discuss in more depth. But in any case, EU policymakers are currently sort of right-sizing the disclosure standards and limiting their applicability, both in terms of the number of companies and the number of data points that need to be reported. So that's very much an ongoing process that we can discuss more later. We can go forward one slide. So this is just a quick look at some of the key climate disclosure standards around the world. I expect these will be familiar to a lot of attendees. There's the CSRD in Europe, which I just mentioned. Another thing I should say about CSRD is it is not a climate disclosure regulation. It is a sustainability disclosure regulation. So it encompasses the E, the S, and the G. There are a lot of data points: human capital management, human rights, biodiversity, resource use that the CSRD covers. So that's kind of one distinguishing factor in addition to the extraterritorial nature of the regulation that I mentioned. And then another key distinguishing feature of the CSRD is that it takes a double materiality approach, which is I'm not just looking at how these sustainability risks impact my company and its financial well-being. So that's traditional financial materiality approach, but it's also how am I, my company, impacting all of my stakeholders along the range of these risks. So that's impact materiality. You take the two together and you have double materiality. So a company is not strictly looking at how, say, sea level rise or water availability will impact their financials. They're also looking at how their operations impact stakeholders along those lines. So just by nature, the double materiality approach makes a lot more data points material for more companies than a strictly financial materiality approach. The UK SDR and the Australian regulation you see there, those are two jurisdictions that are moving towards adopting the ISSB standards. Those are two very important economic jurisdictions, but there's dozens of regulators around the world that are adopting the ISSB standards for their own purposes. Most countries are sort of going through a regulatory process wherein they take the ISSB standards, then they sort of make them fit for purpose for their own country's needs. So it's not like we are just adopting the ISSB whole cloth in most countries around the world, but again, the ISSB standards kind of form the basis for all of these countries' regulations. So the UK, for instance, is undertaking a consultation as we speak. I think it closed this week, sort of requesting information on how the ISSB standards should be purposed for UK securities regulation, and then their actual securities regulator would adopt mandatory disclosure regulations based on that. In the US here, something that's conspicuously absent is a US federal disclosure regulation. We're seeing California SB 253 and 261, which are enacted law in California. SB 253 is an emissions disclosure law that impacts companies with more than $1 billion of revenue that do business in the state of California. So for all intents and purposes, the California disclosure laws are sort of nationwide proxies because, most companies with that level of revenues will do business in California, which is sort of a very low threshold for your sales or property or payroll in the state of California. SB 261 is a climate risk disclosure bill that follows the pillars of the TCFD recommendations, which we just discussed. And that applies to companies with more than $500 million of revenue who, again, do business in California. So taken together, these laws compel both the disclosure of your climate risk information and your scope 1 through 3 greenhouse gas emissions for companies that do the minimum threshold of revenue. We did have a federal climate disclosure regulation in the US. Last year, the Securities and Exchange Commission adopted a mandatory climate disclosure rule that would have impacted all SEC registrants. So generally speaking, public companies with a listing on a US exchange. That is a rule that, when it was originally proposed, looked almost identical to what California has enacted. Between proposal and finalization, there was a 2-year period of the SEC taking extensive public comment. The rule attracted more public comment than any rule in the agency's history. The final rule did take certain steps to sort of scale back the requirements for reporting companies, including cutting scope 3 out of the final rule. Despite the modifications that the SEC made, this would have been the most important regulation, maybe aside from the CSRD in Europe, globally, in terms of setting the baseline for mandatory reporting and having this information actually live in companies' SEC filings, which subjects it to the same sort of rigor and scrutiny that their audited financial information and management discussion and analysis and every other component of a 10K annual report has. So it was a really important accomplishment that the SEC did finalize and adopt this rule. However, the agency was sued immediately. The agency actually, under the Biden administration, did voluntarily stay that rule for the duration of the litigation, which is ongoing now in the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. That litigation, I'll just give sort of a status update of where we are now. Obviously, given the election results, the Trump administration's SEC is not interested in enforcing this rule. They had basically asked the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals to do the agency's job for it and sort of strike down the rule. So you had this peculiar situation where the agency was declining to defend the rule that it itself had adopted. Several Democratic state attorneys general then intervened sort of to do the job of the SEC in defending the rule. The Eighth Circuit just last week basically said, we are not going to proceed to a decision on the merits. If the SEC wants to sort of rescind this rule, they have to do so through an agency rulemaking, which requires official notice and comment and would be a very lengthy process, similar to the one that resulted in the adoption of the rule in the first place. That's something the SEC doesn't want to undertake. So right now we have the litigation is in abeyance. Basically, it's on pause. The rule itself is stayed, so it's not being enforced. What happens next is anyone's guess. This will not impact U.S. public companies for the foreseeable future, at least the duration of this Trump administration. So it's a question of whether the agency actually sort of undertakes a rulemaking to formally rescind the rule, or whether this remains just sort of on the books but not enforced. So that's where we stand currently, but thankfully we have the sort of backdrop of California stepping in to set some sort of baseline for U.S. mandatory disclosure standards. We can go forward. So I think this is something that we've been discussing, but you sort of see the trend here from voluntary to mandatory and where everything stands. I guess this would be a good moment to sort of take stock of what the EU is doing on their omnibus simplification legislation. So the CSRD, the reporting directive, their disclosure standard, it is already in effect. It is law, and there are companies in the first wave of reporters who are already submitting CSRD compliant reports. However, as I said, EU policymakers decided that they were going to undertake a few key steps to sort of roll back these regulations slightly. One was a so-called stop the clock directive, which basically put on pause compliance dates for everyone outside of that first wave of reporters. So, for instance, large EU subsidiaries of non-EU companies, so every US multinational with an in-scope subsidiary in Europe fell into this category. They were due to report next year based on fiscal year 2025 data. The stop the clock directive now has them reporting in 2028 based on fiscal year 27 data. So it's a 2-year delay to the so-called waves 2 and 3 of reporting companies. Alongside that stop the clock directive, there is a so-called substantive directive. So this will actually impact the information being reported and the companies in scope of the directive. For instance, there is discussion of a roughly 80% reduction in the scope of reporting companies in Europe. So, raising the minimum employee headcount to be considered in scope to 1,000 employee minimum, tripling the revenue threshold for non-EU companies with subsidiaries there. So basically, you're looking at severely constraining the number of companies that were preparing to comply with this directive and bringing it more closely in line with the due diligence directive, the CSDD, which always had higher revenue and employee headcount thresholds. Double materiality, that sort of unique element of the CSRD that I just discussed, that has been maintained. However, the actual reporting standards that undergird the CSRD, those are called the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or ESRS. They are also being revised. Currently, there is a consultation underway as we speak to sort of take public feedback on a proposed simplified draft of the ESRS, and that will reduce the number of data points that need to be reported on, sort of cap the value chain reporting that companies need to do, change the materiality assessment, and otherwise sort of reduce the burdens on reporting companies. Alongside the CSRD changes, the omnibus simplification legislation in the EU is also making modifications to the due diligence directive, the CSDD. There's a 1-year delay for the first wave of compliance, but otherwise that mostly remains unchanged, as is the number of companies in scope of the directive. But the EU is considering significantly reducing companies' value chain obligations. So basically limiting your due diligence just mainly to your direct suppliers, limiting the stakeholder engagement that companies need to conduct, sort of, limiting the enforcement mechanisms, such as, you no longer have a duty to terminate your business relationship as a last resort if, elements of your value chain are not in compliance of the directive. So in any case, that is the process that's underway in the EU. The deadline for the technical body to provide advice to the European Commission on simplification of those reporting standards is next month, October 31st. The end of this year is the deadline for all the EU member states to transpose that stop the clock directive into national law. So that would be, the thing that actually gives, for example, the US multinationals more time to comply. And then we expect later this year or early next year adoption of that substantive directive by the European Council and Parliament, and then transposition into EU member states' national laws within a year after that. So that's kind of where we stand in the process. We're very much just in the midst of this simplification in Europe. And then that takes us to California. Where are we on that? So the California disclosure laws take effect next year. Companies are due to report in 2026 based on 2025 data. The only problem is we are still in the middle of regulatory implementation of those laws. So what's happening now is the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, is actually designing the regulations that companies need to comply with. Again, these bills have been passed and enacted into law, signed by Governor Newsom. They've been funded through the California budgetary process, but the legislation itself does not provide all of the specific data points that companies need in order to get their compliance systems in place. That is where the actual implementing regulations come in. So CARB sort of got a late start to this due to holdups in funding and staffing, but they are actively working on it. They've held several public workshops, and they've set a target date of October 14th to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking for at least the first in a series of regulations related to these laws that will establish the fee structure and definitions such as what does doing business in California actually mean? How do we define revenue for the purpose of parent subsidiary relationships? So that is a process that is ongoing, and that October 14th notice of proposed rulemaking would kick off a 45-day comment period when the public would have a chance to give their input. So if you're kind of doing the math on that comment period and when a final regulation might be adopted by the Air Resources Board, you'll figure out pretty quickly that the regulations probably won't all be on the books in time for companies to report in 2026. So the approach that the agency is taking is basically to signal that they'll take a light touch towards enforcement in year one. They've already submitted an enforcement notice related to the emissions disclosure bill, SB 253, that basically says do the best you can with the information you have on hand. Good faith effort, and then we will not penalize companies that are making that good faith effort. It'll probably be something similar for the TCFD disclosure bill, but essentially in year one, companies won't have much time to prepare their compliance in line with regulations. So, but the regulator has signaled that 2026 is still very much the compliance date. So companies should not go pencils down on preparation. They should continue putting systems in place, getting all the data they can. The sooner you're prepared to comply with these laws, the better. So we've discussed kind of the specifics of SB 253 and 261. The CSRD, again, all of these thresholds are subject to change with the EU omnibus legislation, but it requires a lot of the same information required by the ISSB standards and in California. Basically, within the climate disclosure portion of the European regulation, everything kind of aligns with the TCFD recommendations and those main pillars, the greenhouse gas protocol for scope 1 through 3 disclosure. And these laws also all have some element of assurance requirements, third-party verification for emissions disclosure, which I'm sure Green Places would be happy to discuss with you. And you see a few other compliance systems in place here. The New Jersey bill is not yet law. It did not pass last session, but it's it's a good place to note that there are several states that are looking to follow California's lead. Copycat legislation was introduced in New York, New Jersey, Illinois, Colorado. So a lot of other blue states in the US are looking to pass similar laws. And so you see a situation in which, assuming that these are all interoperable standards that require the same information, we certainly don't want to replace that sort of patchwork of voluntary disclosure standards, the alphabet soup, with a similar patchwork of mandatory state laws. But as long as they're all interoperable, we sort of see a state level approach to replacing the absence of a federal disclosure standard. So these would apply to presumably similarly sized companies that do business in those states where these bills have been introduced. So sort of just expanding the dragnet of companies that are supposed to report and also kind of improving the legal defensibility of these laws. California is also in litigation right now. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the California Chamber and other plaintiffs sued the state of California to block the implementation of these laws, although that litigation is proceeding better for the state of California than the SEC's case was expected to in the Eighth Circuit. And then you see Spain listed there, but a lot of other companies, again, are moving forward with often ISSB aligned disclosure standards. Corinne, I don't know if you want to discuss the administration's broader anti-ESG agenda. I can just say briefly that you know, this administration's opposition to climate disclosure is just one component of a broader backlash against ESG at large. Um, the SEC has signaled that it will also sort of revisit the question of shareholder proposals and how investors engage with the companies they own. That has been a target of frequent, hearings and investigations from House Republicans in Congress. There is a broader trend to sort of limit investors' ability to consider ESG related risks, to pressure companies to drop ESG related initiatives, and to just generally penalize any consideration of risks that this administration at least considers what they call non-pecuniary, not financial in nature. Obviously, I think everyone on this call recognizes that there are ways in which climate risk and other sustainability factors can absolutely become material risks for companies and investors. Uh, this administration does not agree with that perspective, so I'll leave it at that. But Corinne, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add here is really that these disclosure requirements and compliance efforts are a response to business need to address financial risk due to climate change. So they're meant to be exercises like the TCFD, like what's requested in the DMA of CSRD, to align your financial outlook with what you expect to be possible from a sustainability perspective with regard to climate change. Can you continue your operations in the same vein as you've been operating thus far? And so this is the demand for an increased complexity around reporting is really happening amidst competing pressure and complexity with this administration's anti-ESG agenda. Cost is like $32 billion in higher household energy costs annually, reduction potentially of 1.7 million jobs. All of this is based on projections from the Heritage Foundation's Project 2050, Project 2025. The environmental impact alone of these measures is obviously a concern existentially. But this is something that we wanted to highlight because of the alignment between financial cost and incentive for businesses to be looking at their financial risk in terms of climate change.
Yeah, and I'll just say on the sort of climate financial risk related side of things, there are federal actions being taken. For example, the U.S. Department of Labor is attempting to undo a Biden administration regulation that would have allowed ERISA plan fiduciaries. So basically, those investors who are responsible for retirement savings and pension plans, allow them to consider ESG related factors as a sort of tiebreaker. So nothing absolves them of their duty to, seek the best risk adjusted returns for their beneficiaries. But if there is an ESG factor that sort of breaks the tie between two comparable investments, that Biden administration regulation would have permitted fiduciaries to consider those risks. So the administration now is seeking to overturn that and put back in place a very unpopular among investors, at least 2020 Trump administration 1.0 rule on that front. But there are also a lot of states, Republican-led states, that are pursuing legislation and in many cases enacting laws that blacklist financial institutions that account for climate risks, that restrict banks and asset managers and most egregiously insurers' ability to account for so-called ESG risks. I mean, consider for a moment like what it means to restrict an insurer from considering environmental risk. If that encompasses all climate-induced severe weather events, that's a pretty radical proposal. So there's just kind of a broader assault on the freedom to invest and the ability of financial institutions to account for what have been widely recognized as significant risks, in many cases material risks for companies and financial institutions. So that is sort of the trend. I think that ESG investing reached a sort of high point under the last administration. It was a very attractive segment of the financial sector. We're now witnessing a pretty unprecedented backlash to that. And then that is compounded by what you see on this slide here, which Corinne, I can let you speak to, but the administration has also undone a lot of the IRA and the incentives that companies had to invest in climate solutions and clean energy. So we're seeing just on multiple fronts any consideration of climate risk or attempt to manage it being sort of penalized by this administration.
Excellent. Yeah. I think, what's critical here, of course, is that companies are again being expected to respond to demands on a compliance and investment perspective, while there's a reduction in investment at the federal level. That causes complexity, that causes chaos. Every client that I work with is still asking for clarity, asking for how they can prepare. And of course, investors find that to be more challenging to address, how to plan long term for any investments that might have addressed climate change or allowed companies to mitigate impact to their stakeholders and their customers. And so, if we can just take forward one, I think this is the reason that we hear from all of our clients, all eyes are really on CARB. Jake spoke to this, but we're awaiting clarity. But it doesn't mean that we can't currently help companies prepare. And so on the next slide, we talk a little bit in detail about what's sort of required from the California regulations in terms of scope 1 and 2 reporting for SB 253. And we've tried to provide a little bit of a breakdown. We get questions constantly about thresholds and minimums. And so this is our attempt to sort of clarify uh, where there is a requirement, who needs to comply. And so if you are a business, a US-based company doing business in California with $500 million in revenue, then you're looking at doing climate risk and response in accordance with the TCFD. That falls into SB 261. You're looking at a January compliance date in 2026. SB 253 is really only pulled into a larger set of companies, sorry, a larger threshold. So a smaller set of companies, $1 billion in revenue, and we're looking at doing calculations for your greenhouse gas emissions. So a really technical disclosure on that front for SB 253. We're still waiting full clarity on the dates in 2026. And the expectation here is that CARB by October will extend clarity. But again, doesn't mean that we aren't able to prepare in the interim, though we've seen the SEC rule voluntarily stayed, though we've seen the omnibus lower expectations for SMEs. We know that California has sort of held firm, and every indication from FAQs and posts from CARB thus far has indicated that they plan to move forward with these rules. The last that I will mention is, of course, AB 1305, which is sort of a lesser known and oft forgotten piece of regulation, but surrounds claims for greenhouse gas reductions or if you're active in the voluntary carbon market. Basically, do you have claims of carbon neutrality sort of in line with the greenwashing, anti-greenwashing trend? So this is a requirement to sort of post specific criteria around disclosures around those claims, justify those with the offsets that you've been purchasing, and justify and substantiate those claims of carbon neutrality. And Jake, I'll let you speak a little bit more about the legal challenges that these are still facing before we turn to supplier engagement.
Sure. One thing I'll just mention that Corinne was discussing on the prior slide about AB 1305, like that is an attempt to sort of standardize and make more transparent the investments that companies are making in mitigation instruments. So SB 253, the emissions disclosure law, says just disclose your scope 1 through 3 emissions in alignment with the greenhouse gas protocol. You are not allowed to net out your emissions disclosures under SB 253 with whatever offsets or credits or environmental attribute certificates or anything else that your company may be investing in voluntarily. So AB 1305 is kind of the mechanism by which companies need to disclose, for instance, the provenance of their offsets and the sort of the registry and certain attributes about those credits and offsets. So that is sort of a separate law for companies that are making those investments. But SB 253 just requires sort of your gross inventory of greenhouse gases. I'll also drop one thing in the chat here, which is just earlier this month, or I may have just dropped it only to the panelists, but I'll hold on to everyone. The Air Resources Board in California did release a preliminary draft guidance checklist for SB 261. So you can see sort of a little more information on what elements of the TCFD recommendations companies are expected to disclose on. And we expect in coming months a lot more details about greenhouse gas emissions disclosure expectations and specifically scope 3. There's a lot of questions about that. So now we're looking at that litigation in California that I mentioned. So U.S. Chamber of Commerce, California Chamber, American Farm Bureau Federation, and others sued the state of California. That litigation is in the Central District of California at the moment. So there were a number of claims that the plaintiffs sued on. One is First Amendment compelled speech, that these laws would compel companies to disclose sort of politically sensitive information or otherwise not straightforward financial information in violation of the First Amendment. There was dormant commerce clause, basically that California is regulating companies beyond its borders, and then relatedly extraterritoriality claims. But basically, the gist of it was California cannot compel these disclosures from companies that are not themselves, incorporated and headquartered in California, because as I mentioned, the impact of these laws expands well beyond California. You do not have to be domiciled or headquartered in California or even do the majority of your business there in order to be in scope. The definition of doing business in California is going to be a very low threshold that even a company with one or two employees in California could certainly meet. Um, so the good news for the state of California is that the judge in the Central District dismissed those extraterritoriality and dormant commerce clause claims. So the only thing that's being litigated currently is that First Amendment compelled speech. Another promising milestone that occurred last month was the plaintiffs asked the court for a preliminary injunction, basically freeze the implementation of these laws. And the judge denied that preliminary injunction, which was a good result for the state in itself, but also the opinion that the judge put out in conjunction with that kind of portends a favorable ultimate decision on the merits. That denial of a preliminary injunction was an appealable decision by that court. So, the U.S. Chamber and the other plaintiffs will probably, not probably, I believe they have appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And so you're going to have the appeal circuit actually weighing in on that preliminary injunction request before the Central District of California is scheduled to hear the argument on the merits for that First Amendment claim. Um, so I guess this is all to say the litigation is proceeding well for the state of California at the moment. A lot hinges on what the Court of Appeals says, but the regulation, unlike what was the case for the SEC and their rule with the litigation in the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, the state of California has not stayed its climate disclosure laws. The regulatory implementation by CARB is very much ongoing, and the agency has said the companies will be responsible for producing reports next year. So, if you are holding off on preparation for compliance in the hopes that a court will strike down these laws, it's looking less likely in California than it did at the federal level with the SEC's rule. But a lot more to follow on that.
And I do see one question in the chat, sorry, in the Q&A widget. Is there any information on how companies' climate risk and response for SB 261 will be assessed and how aligned it must be with TCFD? And essentially, yeah, the guidance so far from CARB on SB 261 is for a TCFD aligned climate risk report. And so those disclosures should follow those 4 pillars and 11 categories within the TCFD, which include an assessment of climate-related financial risks as applied to your company, so your company's operations. There is definitely some suggestion of leniency. I would expect that if you use a different climate risk reporting framework to respond to SB 261, especially in the first year, I think it's highly unlikely that CARB would submit for fines. But broadly speaking, there's direct language in the bill text of SB 261 that references TCFD. And of course, lots of documentation about how to go about doing that process. We also have a lot of resources on our own website. I've done a number of webinars diving into the details of SB 261. It's a scope of work that we undertake with a large number of clients. So if you do have additional questions about how to respond to SB 261 specifically, and of course, the clock is ticking, I'm sure folks are urgently worried about that, please get in touch. Happy to talk about that in more detail.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. So SB 261 requires that every other year a company within scope publish, it could be on its own website, a TCFD aligned climate risk report that follows the recommendations of the TCFD. So you are not actually submitting, as is the case for SB 253, the emissions disclosure law. You're not submitting to the state of California this report. You're just making it publicly available. However, the law does require that CARB adopt regulations that authorize it to seek administrative penalties for companies that either fail to make the reports available or publish an inadequate or insufficient report. And the state is also due to contract with a climate reporting organization to produce, a somewhat regular report that reviews the disclosure by companies within scope of the laws and conducts some sort of systemic or sector-wide analysis of the risks and identify inadequate or insufficient reports. So that is the compliance mechanism. It's administrative penalties. It does not like create a private right of action for parties to sue or anything like that. It's really about the state enforcing this. And as I mentioned, it'll probably be a little while before we see the state take a heavy hand on the enforcement side of things, just because the regulations are so late to come here and companies don't have a ton to work with. Like that draft checklist I put in the chat is really the only thing we've seen from the state in terms of paper on SB 261 so far.
Thanks, Jake. I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure we leave some minutes for folks to ask questions. Go ahead and please continue to drop them in the chat. We can answer them that way. But I'll just talk really quickly through the last two pieces of challenge that companies are experiencing, broader trends, and then what we're seeing from companies in terms of response. And a big one that I can flag with relative simplicity is just challenges around Scope 3 emissions calculations. A lot of the companies that we work for have most of their emissions laying within Scope 3. Scope 1 obviously encompassing all direct emissions, Scope 2 pertaining to indirect consumption of electricity, and then of course Scope 3 is just everything else. And yet Scope 3 faces a lot of challenges in terms of incomplete coverage. So in 2024, 79% of companies reported to CDP disclosed some Scope 3 emissions. 79% of total companies that submitted disclosed some of their Scope 3 emissions, but only 45% still omitted their most material categories. So there's big transparency gaps, and it really undermines the credibility of disclosures. Also, we see low data quality, where supplier data is often incomplete, unreliable, or inconsistent across categories. And current disclosures are really fragmented, which makes it difficult to track emissions or trends, whether or not targets are being met. Part of that is due to the fact that Scope 3 accounting methods were really not designed to measure progress over time. So if you change an estimation method or methodology at all, change suppliers, et cetera, but you don't have the ability to collect that primary data and reflect it in your footprint, you can show or fail to show reductions over time on paper and not really reflect the true picture of decarbonization. The other main challenge and also advantage that I'm seeing in the space right now, of course, is AI. I live in San Francisco, hence the background. That's where I'm based, and of course, this is of constant discussion at the moment. And when we talk about new technologies, we almost always talk about them bringing a paradox. They help solve complex problems while introducing new risks of their own. And AI is really the clearest example of that paradox right now. It's already changing how sustainability work gets done. We use it consistently in our tooling and to develop faster ways to categorize scopes and categories, general ledgers, et cetera, wherever possible, to simplify some of the reporting process. And many companies are increasingly building in the capacity to use AI, which also makes it more challenging to understand the true scale and scope of their emissions. So training a single large AI model can consume several hundred megawatt hours of electricity, which is the equivalent of powering hundreds of US homes a year. Data centers also require large amounts for water and cooling, and that's been a hot topic recently. It's only getting more significant with AI. And projections suggest that by 2030, AI and data centers could consume 8 to 10% of global electricity demand, which is up from about 2% today. But even that 2% is really sort of a staggering figure when you consider how long AI has been around and being utilized by business. And so, we've given a lot of airtime to the challenges that companies are facing, and in part, this is a bit of an empathy exercise. We work with a lot of companies who are trying to respond responsibly and in a compliant way to the chaos that surrounds us. But what we're seeing are really strong signals from those companies. Nearly half of Fortune 500 companies now require suppliers to meet ESG criteria, meaning that businesses that fail to track emissions risk losing key contracts. And we have requirements at that level. We're seeing more and more of the suppliers to the Fortune 500 now feel obligated to report and also reduce their emissions. Requirements from Microsoft, Walmart, et cetera, to reduce their emissions over time, not just to disclose emissions. And so really strong signals that CEOs are starting to recognize that challenge, but respond to it. And they say that they're sticking with their climate strategies. A KPMG survey of almost 1,500 CEOs in markets across North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, um, noted that even as these federal policies shift, the private sector and the state level regulations continue to push sustainability forward, as do their existing voluntary climate commitments and requirements from large companies as well as their suppliers. So we know that we're facing increasing disclosure requirements and pending deadlines on emissions reduction goals with fewer federal resources. Um, but we're still seeing really strong signals that globally, companies are willing to take on this challenge and are able to take on this challenge, in part because what we already knew, in addition to this being an existential crisis for people, this is an existential crisis for businesses. We cannot continue to use resources in the way that we've been using them and continue to do business as usual and succeed. And so really strong signals here. Even with economic pressures and political noise, corporate climate action is accelerating. The data shows that more companies are committing to climate goals, not fewer, in fact, and many are making those goals more ambitious. So SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, is a really strong signal. Near-term target setting almost doubled in 18 months. And the cohort of companies with both near-term and net zero targets more than tripled, 227%, over that same period. That tells us that net zero pledges alone are no longer enough. Businesses are increasingly layering in near-term actionable targets, and that's between 2023 and mid-2025. So even with rollbacks of investment at the federal level for sustainability measures and initiatives in the US. Smaller firms are also becoming more visible players, which is really important. We see this obviously in our business at Green Places. The drop in median revenue of companies making commitments indicates that sustainability is not just for large corporations. Supplier engagement is a big part of what's driving that. And overall ambition is holding steady. 84% of companies are maintaining their climate targets, even through leadership changes, and over a third are increasing ambition. Only really a small share, 16%, are pulling back in some way. And in speaking with those companies directly, what we're seeing is not that they're necessarily full stop withdrawing their climate commitments, but they're rebranding or sort of going dark. And so I do expect that we'll have a gap in data from this period where not every company feels comfortable disclosing or talking about these measures as ESG or sustainability, but we will still see progress. And this, of course, is possible in part because we don't live in sort of an isolationist corporate landscape, right? We live in a global corporate landscape. And so we're seeing that this corporate action really matches those global signals. Global renewable energy investment is at an all-time high. And the US is really the standout in that picture for its decline, with investment falling by more than a third as developers sort of recalibrate under shifting policy. And what we're seeing is that investment is transitioning elsewhere. So it's a reallocation of capital, not a withdrawal of capital, still within the sustainability sector. China remains the dominant market, though the composition of that is changing. Small scale rooftop and distributed solar are booming, and utility scale solar projects are in decline. And the bottom line here is really that investors are not walking away from renewables like you would expect to have seen from watching the IRAs decline. They're rebalancing, they're putting their money into regions and technologies with the strongest returns and policy support, and that's just good business. And so I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for questions. And so I just really briefly want to say, looking ahead, we will send these slides out for you all to use. Some themes that we're planning on addressing at Climate Week next week: transition planning, the integration of AI and climate analytics, and heightened accountability across supply chains are, of course, things that we just talked about now in response to shifting regulations, reporting requirements, et cetera. And these are sort of the steps that we would expect companies to be taking, that we're working on with our clients, preparing for the California regulations, aligning with ISSB and CSRD, integrating risk directly into enterprise risk management systems, and engaging your suppliers. And so now that we've done that sort of speed run of the positive aspects here, I do want to open it up for a little bit of Q&A, either ideally in the chat, Feel free to drop your questions, or I think you are still able to hop on the mic.
While we wait for Q&A to roll in, I'll kind of supplement Corinne's thoughts with some closing thoughts of my own, which is I mean, I painted a gloomy picture about sort of the omnibus simplification process in the EU, but I omitted the fact that the original regulations were so far-reaching and so exhaustive and ambitious that there's a lot of room to scale back and still have very credible and wide-reaching regulations at the end of that process. And so I fully expect the European Union to remain a leader and for a lot of multinational companies to still be subject to those regulations. And I think that, as Corinne said, the US is a complete outlier, at least at the federal level, in terms of the resistance to acknowledging these topics as material risks for companies and financial institutions. The rest of the world will not wait up for the US. And as we've discussed at the subnational level, we have laws and regulations taking effect that are, for all intents and purposes, nationwide in nature. So, there is definitely a convergence on common standards. I also neglected to mention that the California SB 261, the TCFD aligned disclosure bill, also explicitly recognizes the ISSB standards S1 and S2 as, perfectly acceptable for compliance. So as companies increasingly switch over from TCFD to ISSB reporting, California will recognize that, as they will any reporting done in Europe, for instance. Basically, any jurisdiction with mandatory disclosure regulations in place that check all the boxes of the California laws will be accepted for compliance in California. So there's a convergence in terms of the standards being used. There's ongoing mandatory regulations that are taking effect and being enforced. And even if all of this were to fall apart for some reason, I think you will still see an uptick in voluntary reporting, if for no other reason than investors demand it. So companies need to be responsive, not just to their investor base, but to their suppliers, to their counterparties, to potential merger or acquisition targets in jurisdictions that do take these risks seriously. So I think that we might see some downplaying, at least in the U.S. corporate space, because of the target on companies' backs for accounting for these risks and making commitments along those lines. But I do not think that we're going to see, an end to this sort of voluntary reporting. And the momentum is continuing on the mandatory side as well. So it's not all bad.
Excellent. Yeah. And I think sort of on that point, Jake, one quick question for you from the group. As capital markets increasingly reward companies with credible climate strategies, how can organizations position their sustainability efforts to attract investors, lower borrowing costs, and gain competitive advantage? I think this is a question, we hear consistently in the sustainability space, but maybe how it's different now.
Yeah, I think you know, there's a mantra at Ceres that you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think companies that don't transparently disclose their risks and their adaptation and resilience measures, I think that is a signal to the market and to your counterparties, your suppliers, your customers, that you don't take the management of the risk seriously. So I think that it's just sort of now table stakes that at least large companies and particularly public companies are expected to supply some level of information on this. And I think that, for anyone who thinks that disclosure puts them at a competitive disadvantage because they are, demonstrating their weakness to various physical and transition risks, I think that, a component of the TCFD recommendations is also disclosure of climate-related opportunities, and certainly the measures that you're taking to at least mitigate the risks. So I think that by demonstrating the steps you are taking to be on stronger financial and operational footing with regard to these risks, you are better positioning yourself to attract capital. Again, as I said, like if there is a European company that is considering a US company as a potential merger target, like they will not take seriously any company that has not taken steps towards disclosing and managing these risks. So I think it's just a matter of competitive positioning for investors and for other companies in the ecosystem and value chain more than it is as I mentioned at the start, some like sustainability, corporate social responsibility sort of do-gooder approach. Like this is now
Right.
a real like business imperative.
Business imperative is table stakes for sure. Um, One last question before we head out today. My organization is really struggling with Scope 3 data collection. We have a really large and diverse supply chain. What are some practical first steps we can take to engage suppliers and improve that data quality ahead of 2026 reporting and also auditing? And what I always say and recommend on this front is that you really cannot engage all suppliers at once. It is critical in order for you to be able to demonstrate impact and demonstrate progress that you be getting primary data and encouraging suppliers to improve their emissions overall so that it's reflected in your Scope 3 emissions. And so the idea here is really to prioritize. Do your calculations, use estimates to start if you need to, and then prioritize engaging with your top 10, top 5, top 3, whatever you actually have resources to engage directly and work with them. And then make sure that they're doing the same thing. They are working with their suppliers, they're getting primary data. And so you can use the same playbook over and over and over again, as long as you sort of tailor by sector, tailor by industry. And so, of course, that's something that we're here to happy to help with. But I want to be conscious of everyone's time, and we're just a little bit over. Thank you so much, Jake, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on the line. We will happily send this deck out and any links that we've shared in the chat today. But we hope to see lots of you at Climate Week next week. And don't be afraid to reach out. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.